Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar, wherever you are in the world. It's great to have you join us, and also to those of you who will watch on delay. Today, we're very honoured to have two presenters who are going to share from their work and their experience on another dimension of our conversation around military service women and veterans. And today we'll be looking at minority women veterans from an intersectional lens perspective. And our guest presenters today are Ms. Lindsay Church, who's the Executive Director and co-founder of Minority Veterans of America, and Ms. Michelle Dallocchio, who's a Chamorro artist, author, and social worker. And you have their full bios in the info packs that you all will have received. So it's great to have them come and share with us today. Before I hand over to Lindsay and Michelle, I just want to remind you that if you have questions as we go through the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box. If you have comments or resources that you would like to share, please feel free to enter that in the chat stream. So I'd like to hand over now to Lindsay and Michelle and invite you to share with us your thoughts, experiences, and insights.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you all for having us. And, my name is Ms Dallocchio. I'm honored to be sharing this space with Lindsay Church of Minority Veterans of America, and as a Chamorro combat veteran, artist, and social worker specializing in artistic psychosocial rehabilitation. Looking at veterans issues through an intersectional lens is not only a professional priority as a social worker, but it's also a personal one. What we're going to be going into today is pretty much divided into three parts. But before we move into the presentation, we want to be able to cover these three main sections. And it's not moving. Are you able to see it on your side?
Click once, Michelle. It should open.
There we go. It just took like 3 extra clicks. Mercury retrograde. Awesome. So we're going to be going over 3 different sections. One's going to be a quick overview of women veterans data in the US, as well as intersectionality theory. Next, we're going to be covering the intersectional lens and examining how these aspects factor into the veteran experience from race, socioeconomics, and how associated stressors set the stage for a complex trauma. And finally, we'll be addressing LGBTQ veterans' ongoing issues and struggle for rights and the path forward, and bearing all of these intersecting factors in mind.
So before we get started on talking about the intersections of race and sexual orientation, just a little bit of information about women veterans and some of the information that's relevant to the conversations that we're going to have today too. So compared to male veterans, women veterans in the US have unique experiences and issues. Currently, women veterans make up about 10% of the US veteran population, a number which is expected to increase over the coming years and decades as more roles open to women in the actively serving population. Women make up about approximately 12.3% of veterans from Operation Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, and Operation New Dawn. And the median age for women veterans is about 51 years old, drastically lower from that of our male veteran counterparts at 65 years old. There are approximately 2 million women veterans in the United States. Next slide. Oh, one back. All right, so compared to civilian women veteran, or civilian women, excuse me, my goodness. Compared to their civilian counterparts, women veterans have managed to outpace women who have never served in many success markers, including and especially economic impact indicators of success. Women veterans are more likely to have a higher education level, less likely to live in poverty. They have a greater median household income and are more likely to be insured. And yet women veterans are nearly twice as likely to be divorced, more likely to experience homelessness, and less likely to have access to technology. Compared to their male veteran counterparts, women veterans have succeeded in closing the gender pay gap compared to their male counterparts who have never served, but when compared to male veterans, women veterans are more likely to live in poverty, despite being more likely to have a higher education level, have a lower median income, are more likely to be enrolled in food support programs, are twice as likely to have children in the home, and more likely to have no income. And finally, in those that are actively serving, women are the fastest growing demographic in the US military. About 20% are Air Force, 19% are Navy, 15% are Army, and 9% are Marine Corps, and women are, again, the fastest growing demographic in the US military. These numbers are important and telling, but only look at one diversity dimension to best understand the multitude of identities that individuals hold outside of their military and veterans identities. Using a gender-only lens to understand the unique challenges of women veterans is limiting and often diminishes the ability to understand the nuance of the experience of women veterans. Now, turning back to Michelle to discuss intersectionality as a theory and how it applies to understanding and serving minority women veterans.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. Now, how intersectionality plays into every aspect of service from entry into military service to post-military community reintegration is something we're going to be talking about as we cover a few key categories. We'll also talk about how culturally informed client-centered care is critical to not only active service members, but also the currently fractured military veteran community. Now, intersectionality theory was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. And if you're in the realm of social work or anywhere near it, you hear this term quite a bit. However, when it comes to applying intersectionality theory, there's still much left to be desired. But Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality is not exactly focused on just superficial questions or identity politics. Rather, this theory intends to provoke one view as people as complex individuals existing in a variety of systems. So intersectionality is much more about deep structural and systemic questions about discrimination and inequality, and having those needed yet uncomfortable conversations about enacting real change. Now, when it comes to this fun infographic, we're going to be talking about dominant culture, of course, is going to be coming up quite a bit, but it's important to define it before we delve into other aspects of intersectionality. So this can be defined as a group whose members are of a majority who wield more power than other groups. Now, in the United States, the dominant culture is that of cisgender, white, middle-class Christian male of Anglo-Saxon descent, in addition to the main identifiers listed here. Now, dominant culture is one whose beliefs, language, and ways of behaving are imposed on subordinate culture or cultures through economic, social, and political power. Institutionally, it's achieved through a variety of systems, involving legal and political suppression. Dominant culture, of course, perpetuates other sets of values and patterns of behavior, and/or by monopolizing media and other methods of communication, exercising gatekeeping in social and financial capital. Now, it exists to be upheld to marginalize and minimize power and agencies of those who don't fit the intersecting aspects of dominant culture. There's a lot to unpack here in terms of what white supremacist terror is, aka colonialism, but we'll be looking forward to discussing this a bit more in depth as we open up for discussion. Now, this infographic, you're going to see it a little bit later too when we talk about genograms, but this intersectionality map is something that is meant in terms of examining women veterans as a community, but also looking at the different aspects of what makes one's identity unique, and pretty much taking women veterans out of that singular box. A straight white upper middle class straight veteran who is married with an advanced degree is going to have a very different experience from other women veterans who are ethnic minorities, are in non-heteronormative relationships, and with differing belief systems, and so on. Now, for years, VA marketing material to veteran service organizations has centered on experiences of cishet white women veterans, as though the women veteran community was simply a monolith of white womanhood. But we're here to provide a bit of myth busting on that, in addition to clarify why this narrative is yet another arm of white supremacy and oppression in veteran care. People, as you can see here, with all the different intersecting qualities that come with intersectionality, and it's not limited to just these categories either, but this is a helpful start. People are complex individuals, and having all these different qualities come together to form a unique identity and lens in which they view the world is important to bear in mind. In terms of minority women veterans, it's all the more important that diversity, equity, and inclusion are not just buzzwords. They're not just something to, have as bonus points on PowerPoints, or Zoom webinars. And they need to be incorporated into data collection all the way through direct client care and outreach. Now, in the beginning of this, we're going to be talking a bit about race in the military. Now, race in the military specific areas of studies that have intrigued me from day one of enlistment. Seeing how racism, sexism, homophobia, and all other bigotry played out throughout my enlistment could very well be one of the things that landed me back in mental health and specifically social work. Now, throughout the next few slides, there are some main points to consider and are pretty common in terms of the history of racism and segregation in the United States Armed Forces. Now, in terms of where that's gone through civil rights, actually, before we move on to that, some of these factors that we're going to be considering going along the way are, of course, incarceration rates, education, income, and political climate. We'll get into that a bit more in detail toward the end. But starting from desegregation, there are, of course, a bunch of other socioeconomic factors that should be examined, but in terms of what's going on with COVID-19, the political climate, all of these, of course, need to be addressed with compassion and an intersectional lens. But starting from 1948, President Truman lifted the ban on racial segregation in the armed forces. But where were we exactly in terms of voting rights? In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled on a landmark case, Brown versus Board of Education, that desegregated schools. However, Native Americans weren't granted the right to vote until about 1948. Women gained voting rights in 1920, but there were three main activists that I can identify that were minority veterans. One is a Native American U.S. Marine Corps veteran named Miguel Trujillo, and he sued the state of New Mexico for his right to vote, which actually granted access for Native Americans for their right to vote. Later on with the Voting Rights Act, excuse me one second. African Americans were able to exercise their vote as guaranteed under the 15th Amendment in the US Constitution. And this was partly thanks to people like Medgar Evers, who is a US Army World War II veteran, who worked for pushing for voting rights, ending segregation of public facilities, and so on. He was assassinated by the KKK in 1963 before the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But an additional civil rights champion I do want to mention is a bisexual African-American woman named Josephine Baker, who served with the French resistance during World War II and fought against Nazis. Now, she was the only female speaker on the March on Washington in 1968, and we're hoping to see a trend with minority veterans engaged in civil rights activism. Now, before moving on to racism in the military and veteran community, what I did want to note was that not everybody in the US can vote. To this day, residents of the US territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, the CNMI, American Samoa, and the US Virgin Islands, about 4.1 million people, do not have the right to vote in US presidential elections. Now, I know that's something that's not necessarily brought up a lot in veteran circles, but it's something that's going to be a little more visible as we go along and talk about Indigenous veterans and racism in the military. Before I go too far. Now, racism in the military and the veteran community is something that seemed anecdotal to me when I was coming back from the Iraq War, but it's still pretty much a hot button issue. And of course, Lindsay will expand on that a little bit later as well, in terms of other forms of bigotry and discrimination that minority veterans can face. But the way it's compounded PTSD is interesting, to say the least. Considering all the other intersecting issues that come with life as an ethnic minority in the United States, it should come as no surprise that minority veterans experience higher rates of complex PTSD. In researching complex PTSD, Dr. Ray Scurfield and other researchers basically brought together a group of Vietnam War veterans who experienced racism in the military. So African American veterans, Asian American veterans, and even Pacific Islander veterans were included in the study. This went from combat exposure, assault, toxic leadership, hazing, and other polytrauma. And as you can understand, that makes for a very difficult community reintegration. Now, additionally, Dr. Scurfield's study did go through various nonprofits and VSO programs, and there is a sense of discomfort for minorities retelling these stories to non-minorities about degrading and traumatic experiences. I, for one, can definitely second this, and we'll get into, I guess, more personal stories toward the end, but it definitely complicates the process of coming home and actually integrating into civilian life. Now, some of the race-related stressors that Dr. Scurfield and his team came up with were exposure to racial prejudice and stigmatization. So this was mostly the direct personal experiences where somebody is discriminated against, excluded by virtue of race, in addition to harassment and dehumanization. The second is bicultural or ambiguous identification and the process of dehumanization again, but this is actually more about othering other service members who don't conform to the dominant culture paradigm. So regardless of service, if you don't fit that mold, you're pretty much vulnerable to that process of dehumanization as one would do with the enemy. And finally, the exposure to the racist environment, which is defined as having witnessed remarks or behavior by fellow military personnel that denigrate, harass, or dehumanize ethnic minorities. But when an environment of bigotry is tolerated, enabled, and even promotable, there's a deep sense of betrayal that's felt across race, gender, orientation, and all other intersecting qualities that exist in the ranks. This has, of course, spilled over time and again into the veteran community and veteran healthcare. Now, as a bisexual Chamorro combat veteran who served in the Iraq War, I had the misfortune of experiencing the trauma of all three while in combat. Now moving into a different intersecting subject, incarceration rates. What we've noticed that there is a downward trend in veteran incarceration for the general population, or compared to the general population. However, justice interactions and arrests occurred about at 9% for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, and more than half of those veterans who were serving for violent crimes and violent offenses. Additionally, in terms of maintaining an intersectional lens, we must be mindful of how the justice system affects other ethnic minorities that might not necessarily show up in studies like this, where you see a segment of the veteran population who is incarcerated. So it should be considered whether it's intake or outreach in terms of how those respective communities are interacting with the justice system. Now, Lindsay did touch upon this a bit, and rates for suicide and homelessness are on the rise in the women veteran community, and considering that homeless shelters restrict women veterans based on their veterans benefits, and I can tell you personally, it took about 13 years to receive my VBA benefits. Basic needs for women veterans must be examined before addressing other aspects of ongoing care. Additionally, what we've noticed that when it comes to getting treatment for complex PTSD, major depression, and so on, women veterans programs are largely set up around military sexual trauma. Now, this doesn't take into account race-based trauma, toxic leadership trauma, combat exposure, and the like. And as we're seeing an uptick in unemployment rates due to COVID-19, we're certainly looking into how this is affecting the minority veteran community. Now, these are some of the general effects of racism in the military and veteran community. And where does incarceration, homelessness, and lack of access to service come into play beyond the spectrum of gender? Well, the answers are a bit more disconcerting, but we'll get into that shortly. Now, something that we were working on when Lindsay and I were starting this presentation and working together was something that we've noticed time and again when we were doing our research and making sure that our numbers were up to date, is that underrepresented minorities in military veteran data were often either not fully covered or were completely absent from research period. And that's something that we want to stress throughout this presentation, that diversity, equity, and inclusion and data equity cannot be stressed enough. And data is powered by research practices, which in turn affects marginalized communities and their ability to receive funding. When ethnic minorities, in addition to other non-dominant culture factors and identities, are excluded from data and research, it is an act of institutional or structural violence. It is a form of social and economic disempowerment, and this is through egregious exclusion. Now, we did have a video to play. However, it's about 9 minutes. So I am going to be including this on the presentation. So if you do want to access this, or if we do have a little bit more time toward the end, we can play it. But this is pretty much covering U.S. territories, voting rights, and how U.S. Armed Forces recruiters are pretty much turning it into a recruiting paradise. So it's actually one of the places that, well, they cover mostly Guam, the Marianas, and American Samoa, and how those regions are pretty much targeted for recruitment, enlistment, and primarily into combat arms, MOSs, or military occupational specialties. But for the sake of time, we're going to move on ahead. And if we do get time, we'll watch it. But the reason why that we were pulling this up in terms of Indigenous military service is that Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, in addition to Native Americans, serve at higher rates than any other ethnic group per capita in the United States. And looking at the data, it's not by accident. And as mentioned before, Native Americans couldn't vote until a Native Marine Corps veteran sued the state of New Mexico in 1947, and voting rights came into play in 1948. Additionally, of course, the territories, Guam, CNMI, American Samoa, Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, still can't vote for a US president. And this law is actually based on the earliest insular cases by the Supreme Court, which allowed the separate but equal segregation in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. That case was overturned, but in this case, which is referred to as Downs versus Bidwell in 1901, is the basis of denying Indigenous peoples or ethnic minorities the right to vote for a US president. And in the legislation, it states, the people in the US territories were inhabited by, or the US territories were inhabited by alien races that couldn't comprehend Anglo-Saxon principles. So what does that mean? If I move back to my ancestral homeland in the CNMI as a Chamorro, as a combat veteran, I lose my right to vote for the leader who has the power to send my Indigenous relatives to war. And as atrocious as that sounds and is, that hasn't stopped US Armed Forces recruiters into turning the Pacific into a recruiter's paradise. They exceed their quotas in the Pacific. It is also ensured that because we're excluded from data, that VA healthcare, due to data inequity once again, doesn't reach these islands with the highest veteran populations per capita. It's estimated that 1 in 8 people in the Marianas is a veteran, and most likely combat arms and a combat veteran. In a PBS investigation called America by the Numbers, they pretty much stated that Guam ranked dead last in VA funding. So when it comes to data equity, this is the kind of damage that we're looking at. Now, as a Chamorro woman who's lived in the US Southwest, specifically Arizona and Nevada, for about a decade, I noticed a variety of historical and cultural parallels that existed between Native Americans and Pacific Islanders. And it's a bit unsurprising that socioeconomic challenges exist for our respective communities, as they stem from a long history of colonialism, genocide, and ongoing occupation of our native lands. Additionally, it caught my attention that when data included Native Americans and Pacific Islanders disaggregated from Asian Americans, it quantified the exploitation by dominant culture too. So a lot of these factors that we're looking at, from high enlistment and high incarceration, voting rights being denied at certain points, even if it's on our land, matriarchal cultures that still exist, ongoing land disputes. The Trump administration sued the Marianas for the Chamorro Land Trust, which guarantees land rights to indigenous peoples. We have our languages disappearing, high poverty, preventable diseases, high rates of suicide, and low education, income, and representation. Now, in terms of race and enlistment, we took a study from the US Army that pretty much measured everybody out per capita in terms of enlistment only. It came up again that Native Americans, or AIAN, were over-enlisting, in addition to Native Hawaiians, other Pacific Islanders, who were enlisting at a rate of 249% per capita. And that is, so basically we're out serving people, even though we're the smallest federally recognized ethnic minority in the United States. Latinx and Asian Americans enlist at rates slightly lower per capita, or just at the bar. And of course, recruitment goals are met and exceeded in the Pacific. Now, when it comes to all of those different factors, we have indigenous powered military, we have weapons and aircrafts named after Native Americans, people love hakas and Pacific Islander warrior culture, and even more so thanks to The Rock, Jason Momoa, Keanu Reeves, and so on. But when it comes to equity and inclusion in the military and veteran data, we're largely left out. And our cultural items and spirits seem to be loved, but when it comes to having a voice, our mics are often muted. But why is that? Well, via dominant culture and its lens, the US has historically marginalized and disenfranchised indigenous groups. And I know for other people in other countries that this is not new, and it's definitely a trend, but it's no wonder exploitation is so prevalent in culturally, economically, and all the way through interweaving systems of institutional power. And to add further insult to injury, Trump recently announced that he was wanting to cut COVID funding to US territories and Native tribes in the United States. In terms of the hardest hit communities, according to the LA Times, Pacific Islanders have been disproportionately hit by COVID-related losses and deaths, in addition to Native Americans. When we're talking about cultural genocide as listed here, when people think of the word genocide, they think about the physically direct violent aspects. However, genocide is not solely one of physical death, and it's also a psychological death that Sun Tzu described in The Art of War. Cultural genocide side effects: alcoholism, disease, poverty, depression, suicide, domestic violence, crime, a loss of identity and self-worth. Combine this with traumatic experiences acquired in the military and ignored or left out by Veterans Affairs and service organizations, it's no wonder that there's a sense of distrust and alienation in minority veteran circles and the institutions that are supposed to be having our backs. Another point to consider, even if it's not necessarily a veteran statistic, is that other racial groups are experiencing life in a very different way and through a very different lens. Victims of violent crime, violence against women as a colonial malaise and linked to white supremacist violence and patriarchy. One stat that came up in addition to the United States stats were Indigenous women in Canada are also 12 times as likely to go missing or murdered than any other ethnic group. And in the United States, 96% of sexual violence against Native women is committed by non-natives taking advantage of varying jurisdictions and tribal lands. So basically, Native American tribes lack jurisdiction over non-natives who commit crimes in their jurisdiction or on their land. So there's a lot more to unpack with that. However, for the sake of time, we're going to be going through. While national, even global awareness through the Black Lives Matter movement has shed light on systemic racism, direct violence through law enforcement, and oppression of African Americans in the United States, it's also important to consider that many of these systems of oppression are what minority veterans have in common. This is also the time to be proactive in our work with veterans and justice work using an intersectional lens. And as you can see, Native Americans are also disproportionately targeted by law enforcement and over-incarcerated. Additionally, when it comes to law enforcement interactions, especially violent ones, when we exclude groups like Native Americans, we also miss out on seeing data and research that demand our attention and response. Now, considering the position in the world and where I come from, anytime that I tell people that I'm from the Marianas, I usually use Australia as the launching point to say, do you see that peninsula in Australia? Just keep going up and you might see a few specks of land in the Pacific. But even though the CNMI and Guam are US territories, somebody like me has to constantly not only explain that to fellow veterans, other people that I work with, but I also have to explain this in my own care. Now, when it comes to defining Pacific Islanders, for the sake of those, or for those who are unfamiliar, Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders are a federally recognized ethnic group that has been separated from Asians since the 1990s. Now, we're divided into three main regions, as you see here: Melanesia in the southwest, Micronesia to its north, and Polynesia as the larger triangle with Hawaii, Aotearoa, or New Zealand, and Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, in the farthest points. Now, when our data is lumped together with Asian Americans, much of the alarming issues for Indigenous Pacific Islanders and what we face gets swept under the rug, and often for the most ludicrous reasons. Also, like Native Americans, we deal with quite a bit of settler colonialism, outlandish cultural appropriation, and erasure for vital statistics. Now, something that we didn't notice when we were able to locate the data is that Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander women outpace their male counterparts in enlistment per capita. And in terms of coming from my own voice, I believe it's largely having to do with, we come from matriarchal cultures that don't necessarily conform to Western or East Asian standards in femininity, gender binaries, behavior, and customs, and so on. While we represent the highest enlisting ethnic group per capita, our voices are often either erroneously or intentionally excluded from conversations on the military and veteran issues. And as mentioned before, we still lack voting rights when we go back and live in our own land. So how does all of this come together when adding even more intersecting factors? So when it comes to women veterans having to deal with rape culture and dominant culture, like the study on racism, there's a process of dehumanization that also applies to anyone who isn't a cishet male. Instead of studying various groups or various forms of bigotry and see the macro perspective that our struggles are tied together, we can effectively work toward that collective liberation. So long as we don't use an intersectional lens to identify where oppression is intertwined, we all pretty much remain wandering and vulnerable. In terms of dehumanization, all the way through intimate partner violence, dominant culture uphold systems in which sociopaths are allowed to thrive. In a separate article, we've explored ways mass shooters, toxic masculinity, domestic violence, and two specific personality disorders are linked. Those personality disorders are narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, all while gravitating toward military and law enforcement careers in effort to gain access to vulnerable populations, all of which seem contrary to US Armed Forces values. With suicide, homelessness, and unemployment on the rise, we're all a bit late in putting theory into application. Now, while the ban on women in combat was officially lifted in 2013, women have been serving in direct combat operations prior to this date. When it comes to cultural adjustments, which I can speak on as a former member of Team Lioness, it was a non-issue while we were in theater. I served on Team Lioness from 2004 to 2005. And it wasn't until I came home and saw, of course, more politicized by far-right wing media outlets disparaging our service and mocking women veterans. And this kind of became the norm, and you see this reverberate throughout VA care as well. And it's not necessarily the fault of the providers necessarily, but it's in the community and it hasn't been addressed properly. The backlash against women in combat roles was as expected as all other aspects of bigotry, if you look at it from that perspective. And it's something that, of course, exists in the military today and the veteran community, but its spillover into veteran healthcare has proven to be detrimental. Now, the first time I recall seeing the first female casualty during the invasion of Iraq, PFC Lori Paestoa, featured in the photo in the slide, it was something that sat with me pre-deployment and throughout deployment. And while Jessica Lynch dominated the headlines, who was also a POW, I was curious about the details of the first woman to die in combat as a Native American woman, but also another Black woman veteran, Shoshana Johnson. And the depiction of how these three women were portrayed throughout the world told me that I knew I would already have a difficult time serving with and trusting my fellow soldiers, but the way that this was being portrayed was already not very equitable. And it wasn't necessarily based on what happened on the ground in combat with them and their unit, but the way the stories were covered. And when I got home, I got to witness how women veteran voices were covered. It all went back to white heterosexual female voices with no uncomfortable opinions outside of girl power. And that was really difficult because I didn't see myself in any of those lenses in terms of what does a healthy post-war homecoming really look like. So the process of returning from Iraq and after facing not only combat, but toxic leadership and racial persecution by a white supremacist command was a painful one in which I never saw justice. And when I reached out for help to VA when I came back and got out of Fort Benning, I was denied benefits because I was told that women didn't serve in combat, and I wasn't believed, and I've been hung up on twice within a few weeks apart. So it was very apparent that they weren't ready to not just accept me as a woman combat veteran, but they weren't ready to accept a Chamorro one. They weren't ready to accept a bisexual one. They weren't ready to hear somebody who already knew what was going on because they were both a medic and a mental health sergeant, and that my symptoms were real. So we owe all of this in an intersectional lens to all veterans to provide equitable care, but that can't be done without putting that lens into practice and practicing data equity. So just a few lenses to consider. There are changes in religious demographics that we are noticing in terms of people who identify as atheists or non-religious. And that's not necessarily being catered to. There's still a lot of religious ceremony within the ranks in the US military, but it would be interesting to see how this plays into the future as we're seeing that percentage increase in the United States. Justice system interactions that we talked about and incarceration and how that's been on the decline. Political climate for minorities, women and LGBTQ veterans is of course something that is ongoing. And of course we can talk a bit more about in depth toward the end. Veteran service organizations and how they've treated minority veterans and minority women veterans in general has been pretty difficult. It's not been great. And like I just mentioned, media representation, own voices of actual women veterans haven't necessarily been diverse and inclusive. And we do need those underrepresented voices to be included in the narrative. Once we have data equity and disaggregation of that data, we can incorporate a lot of those underrepresented voices to create a tapestry that is far more complete. And considering complex polytrauma and existing and non-existing resources, that's something that obviously is still a work in progress. Now I'm going to pass this over to Lindsay, who's going to be covering the next segment.
Let me see if I can get myself off of mute. All right. So next slide, please. We're going to discuss LGBTQ status in the military and the veteran community. So the U.S. military has a long history of using structural and legal discrimination to dissuade LGBTQ members from joining and serving. Prior to 1993, the military had myriad policies that criminalized and demonized LGBTQ individuals. Prior to the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, prior to Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was implemented, service members had differing experiences ranging from outright discriminatory, being classified as sexual deviants, to experiences of not being bothered or left alone and being more bothered by the introduction of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 1993. So in 1993, under President Bill Clinton, the DoD enacted a policy that was originally intended to protect LGBTQ service members. The policy prohibited military service or military personnel from discriminating against or harassing closeted lesbian, gay, bisexual service members. In exchange, lesbian, gay, and bisexual service members were prohibited from disclosing their sexual orientation or engaging in homosexual conduct in public. While the policy was originally intended to protect LGBT service members, it had many unintended consequences in the lives and mental well-being of those serving under the policy. The argument for Don't Ask, Don't Tell was that their presence would create an unacceptable risk to high standards of morale, good order and discipline, and unit cohesion that are the essence of military capability. The same argument has been recycled to be applied to implement the transgender military ban. It is important to note that Don't Ask, Don't Tell never protected transgender individuals. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was solely focused on sexual orientation and not gender identity. The military trans ban went into place in April 2019 and categorically banned transgender people or transgender individuals from serving in the military as their authentic selves. Waivers were given to folks who were able to obtain appropriate diagnoses prior to the date of the ban's implementation. Despite the delay in open service, it is estimated that there are nearly 134,000 transgender service members in the US. This means that most of us that have served in the US military have served with at least one transgender individual during our time in the military. Next slide. So going back to Michelle's point of data equity, VHA or the Veterans Health Administration and the DoD do not collect sexual orientation in the medical records of service members, which actually perpetuates a culture of not asking about and not telling sexual orientation in routine care, which we see as a holdover of the remainder of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Currently, it's not known how many LGBTQ veterans use VHA, but it does appear by VA standards, that LGBT veterans, women veterans are using the services at elevated rates. Among veterans, a greater proportion of women identified as sexual minorities compared with men, and despite smaller numbers, women veterans are the fastest growing group in VHA users, so the Veteran Health Administration. Due to lack of collection of LGBTQ status of service members and veterans, data is less available and more difficult to quantify in exact numbers. This data limitation leads to lack of funding and research to continue to serve these communities. No DoD or VA data collection means relying on surveys and news outlets to help us understand the LGBTQ military and veteran population. However, according to a 2015 health-related behavior survey of active duty populations, 5.8% of service members are identified as LGBT, 1.9% of men identified as gay, 2% of men identified as bisexual, 7% of women identified as lesbian, and 9.1% of women identified as bisexual, 0.6% identified as transgender. So it is believed that there are based off of survey and information, it's believed that there are about 1 million LGBT veterans and about 134 to 163 transgender service members. Next slide. Okay, so going back to intersectionality and Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, or Dr. Crenshaw's theory, looking solely at women as a category of diversity means that we miss things and fail to recognize that systems of oppressions are actually compounded and not just one over the other. So when you're looking at veteran status, we already recognize that it comes with a specific set of oppressive systems that come with it. We also recognize that by looking at women, we are actually employing this intersectionality theory to begin with. When you go further than that, we actually recognize that there are compounding systems of oppression that exist when it comes to LGBTQ women specifically. So we recognize that gender-based discrimination shows up, as Michelle explained, but these systems in the LGBT community can show up as the patriarchy can actually mean that women, LGBTQ individuals are not able to hold leadership roles. Toxic masculinity can present as violent reaction to masculine women and gender diverse folks. Compounded, and this is all compounded if gender diverse and non-cisgender. Going back to that minority stress theory, women veterans who identified as LGBT may feel the impact of minority stress even more than men given their dual minority status. Structural and religious forces that shape military and civilian culture can also factor into the hospitability for LGBTQ individuals. Despite a secular government and services, this has had little impact on keeping religion out of the architecture of our systems and services. LGBT women veterans are also more likely to have experienced sexual violence, including during military service, compared with non-LGBT women veterans, resulting in elevated risk of suicide, mental health challenges, alcohol, and drug abuse. Next. So what are the impacts of this? So next slide, please. So LGBTQ veterans, women specifically, experience mental health challenges at a greater risk. Gay service members suffer from post-traumatic stress at over 3 times the rate compared to heterosexual service members. For lesbian service members, this grows from 67% suffer from post-traumatic stress compared to 19% of heterosexual female service members. In the field of military sexual trauma, LGBT veterans are more likely to have experienced sexual assault and trauma prior to and during service, and LGBT service members were twice as likely to experience military sexual assault. These are directly linked to post-traumatic stress and depression among LGBT veterans. In the field of drug use and abuse, LGBT individuals are more likely to have reported binge drinking, cigarette smoking, moderate to severe depression, and suicidal ideation and attempts. Rates of suicidal ideation are 2 to 3 times higher for LGBT community, and suicide attempts 2 to 7 times more frequent. For homelessness, 1 in 5 transgender service member or transgender veterans are or have experienced homelessness. Anecdotally, I'm from the city of Seattle, and you can actually see the rise of trans and gender diverse veterans are 5 times more likely to be experiencing homelessness in King County than their cisgender counterparts. One of the fastest growing populations in homelessness in the city of Seattle. So lastly, identity fracture. For those who enlisted in the military during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell period and were LGBTQ, joined with the assumption that they wouldn't be discriminated against, harassed, or dismissed for their queer identity so long as they didn't publicly engage in homosexual acts. This understanding meant that no matter how out and proud you were or weren't in your former life, you were not to be gay in public or risk discharge. This agreement that you make with yourself in order to abide by the agreement you made with the US government can create a type of fracture in your identity, where you may be in a loving partnership with your same-sex partner in your civilian clothes. When you put that uniform on, they cease to exist. With every person that you let into your personal life to see this part of you, you are allowing in risk that they will keep your secret. With all that you endure when you wear the uniform, many come home to say goodbye to their military identity and choose to be a part of the LGBTQ identity. Others do the opposite and choose to be a veteran and do not engage with their LGBTQ community. There are some that do neither, and even fewer who get to hold both identities in the spaces that they exist in. This voluntary closeting of your identity or leaving an entire community behind can create a sense of shame for serving, which is inherently a source of pride in nearly every other aspect of a person's life. Outside of all that, it's important to remember that no matter what, there are many who still hold other than honorable and bad conduct discharges from Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So that identity fracture, oftentimes you leave behind, you take that uniform off and you leave it behind, causing a fracture in your identity of your life that you live in the closet. Next slide. So from Brown and Jones, discharge status may have an outsized impact on the LGBTQ veterans who may have been involuntarily separated, like I just discussed about the Don't Ask, Don't Tell discharges. If veterans are separated with an other than honorable discharge, these veterans would not have access to the benefits, compounding an overall distrust of the military and veterans system and a feeling of being unwelcome. In a 2015 study, indicated that transgender veterans are twice as likely to be involved in the justice system as their cisgender counterparts. Broadly, under Don't Ask, Don't Tell and the previous policies dating back to World War II, it's expected that estimated that there's about 100,000 service members who are discharged for bad paper discharges based solely on their LGBTQ status alone. And finally, bad paper discharges can have long consequences for veterans. This can include barring from jobs, loss of VA care, which we've gone back to VA being one of the largest providers of care, not being able to access care, loss of assistance in the transition from military to civilian life. Much of this has been worked through in the congressional work, trying to make it easier for discharge upgrades to happen for LGBTQ service members, but these are not automatic, meaning that so the onus is on the service member to, again, go back to the system that at one point harmed them to be able to gain access to an honorable or a general or an admin discharge to be able to get access to their VA benefits. For some, this is a possibility and a godsend, and for other people, this can actually be just as much of a barrier as not ever having the opportunity. Next slide, please. All right, in terms of transgender-specific healthcare, gender confirmation surgery is specifically excluded from the VA benefits, medical benefits packages. Additionally, because VA healthcare is considered minimum essential coverage under the Affordable Care Act, a lot of people are not able to access the policies that they would be able to, these public policies that they would be able to get this care under because they already have VA care. So oftentimes it reduces or eliminates the ability to use public insurance to be able to get gender confirming care. In a study of lesbian veterans seeking healthcare at the VA, 10% reported experiencing harassment, 10% reported that they had been refused treatment, and 50% feared that the VHA providers knew about their sexual orientation, that if they found out, they would be mistreated. This resulted in some LGBT women reporting delaying or missing needed care altogether. Primarily due to the concern about interacting with other veterans, which can be a toxic environment for many of us that experience using the VA. The majority of LGBT veterans reported experiencing LGBT-based discrimination in healthcare, which was associated with higher rates of tobacco use and and less comfort in disclosing their LGBT identity to providers. In a study of lesbian veterans seeking healthcare repeating that one, research has shown that the stigma, prejudice, and discrimination create a hostile and stressful social environment that causes mental health problems known as minority stress. Efforts to reduce homophobia and transphobia are an important component of broader efforts to improve mental health in the veteran community. Minority stress model indicates that poorer health and earlier deaths noted in LGBT people result from a combination of factors, including the stress of concealment, discrimination, and stigma, including institutional stigma, as evidenced by non-inclusive policies. Next slide, please. And then kind of going back to some of Michelle's previous points, many of these, the effects of homophobia in the veteran community do mirror many of the effects of racism in the veteran community when you're looking at microaggressions. Very similar to we see on a pretty regular basis. That's so gay. It's okay that you're gay, but you don't need to talk about your wife. So looking at these daily occurrences that we see in the veteran space that continue to be accepted as a joke and expected that the minority person in the room is expected to just brush it off and let it be known that this is part of the community. This can also lead to an institutionalized and direct violence. Much when I spoke earlier, that toxic masculinity can often present in a way that when you are a masculine appearing, whether that be LGBT or a woman in general, but especially when you're LGBT and you are also in the same dating pool, can often be you can be met with institutionalized or direct violence against you. This again goes back to marginalization in the veteran community. You can be left out. Cultures are created that are toxic and intentionally for LGBTQ women and minorities. Institutionalized discrimination that often mirrors that of the military. This can be seen in some of the work that was done around Don't Ask, Don't Tell, that meant some of the VSOs were actually involved in keeping Don't Ask, Don't Tell in place and continuing to lobby for that to stay there. And then finally, you're asked to keep your personal life separate. For reference, my first night in a traditional VSO, I was actually told that it was okay that I was gay, but I didn't need to talk about my wife, asking me to continue to perpetuate the policy of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where it's more comfortable for people not to know that I'm gay, but it's okay for my leadership abilities to be used and abused for whatever purposes. And then the last is being just outright kept from positions of leadership or discounted for whatever reason, whether that be in line with your LGBT identity, within the veteran community, within the religion community. It's experienced at a pretty regular level. So that's all I got. You're muted.
And back. All right. So moving on to the medical and behavioral health segment and incorporating all that we've talked about, what disparities exist. And even though we covered some of those in the previous slides, something that we did want to talk about, even though this is evidenced by updated Veterans Affairs marketing collateral, there is also evidence via a survey that women veterans don't often feel valued, recognized, respected within the veteran healthcare system. And it's a general culture in the veteran community that allows such abuse. And it's one that's overdue for a change. And right before this presentation, just a day ago, a colleague of mine who works at a VA medical center in Arizona was sharing with me how an older colleague, who's a white woman, who was often overheard saying that women don't belong in the military, women don't belong in combat, saying blatantly racist things about ethnic minority veterans, as well as homophobic statements. While she's been repeatedly called out for this behavior, the very systems that serve veterans in a state that has a high Native American population has been allowing bigots like this to stay and contaminate veteran care. And we'll talk about those solutions in a bit, but we did want to highlight that even though we can represent all these stats and just put them out there on a neat PowerPoint presentation, the fact states that there's definitely a needed cultural change. And this is nice to have a more diverse representation on marketing collateral, but it has to go much deeper than that. If we're allowing this with staff members in veterans healthcare, imagine what that person's going to do to affect a veteran's ongoing care, whether that's mental health or medical. And it's a bit disconcerting, but it was unfortunately unsurprising. Now, other healthcare disparities for racial minority veterans, like we talked about, there is insufficient data of ethnic minority groups. Sometimes we are present in different reports, but most often we are not. And data disaggregation is lacking, specifically with Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians of the Pacific Islanders, but Native Americans and NHPI veterans are often excluded. Race-based trauma is ongoing in the veteran community, and this, of course, impacts community reintegration, VA care, and interaction with VSOs. But some of the things that we do want to talk about outside of theory and data equity is some of the solutions or ways to put theory into application. Now, I listed military genograms here because it's something that we've used before in different social work practices that usually was a one-page diagram, but pretty much like the intersectionality diagram that I posted earlier, or infographic, it pretty much outlined family systems and associated trauma. And I found that using the intersectionality chart was a bit more comprehensive and a great jumping off point for delving into comprehensive one-time interviews. While working Army mental health, our intake interviews were roughly 2 hours, which might seem long, but it also meant to serve the client in a way that they didn't have to keep retelling their history or bits and pieces that providers would later have to figure out. Data equity and inclusion relies on not only asking these questions and including people in research, it also means figuring out how to address our community in the best way possible. Like I stated before, disaggregating data between Asians and Pacific Islanders, which is something you still see in US Veterans Affairs and DoD literature. And it's an ongoing issue in the United States as evidenced by the service rates. And when one exponentially larger group absorbs a smaller, marginalized, higher enlisting group, pertinent data disappears, whether out of ignorance or convenience, or possibly both. Now, hiring more diverse healthcare staff is one suggestion, but I would also suggest screening for some of these other traits that we were talking about in terms of narcissistic traits, antisocial traits, or MPD or APD for both military service, prior to military service, and also for anybody involved in veterans care of any sort. Training in diversity and equity and inclusion, ongoing professional development should be also incorporating critical race theory as well as intersectionality theory as frameworks. We could take these simple methods for examining how socioeconomic disadvantages, mental health disparities, and institutionalized discrimination affect military veteran outcomes in a variety of systems. So treatment, this is pretty much a summary of what I just stated. So this is pretty much going in 3 different steps and building upon that intersectional lens, which is consolidating the data and responding with evidence-based interventions that are appropriate for the client, and implementing treatment plans that are mindful of various intersecting aspects of the veteran. So this is just to revisit the infographic and all the different things that we're going to be looking at in terms of the veteran identity. And another way to use the intersectional lens is, on top of documentation, use it as a guide to where you might need further additional education and training. As a 1-page overview, one that's pretty much on top of a comprehensive intake, this lens helps us view service members and veterans as not just a sum of intersecting identities, but as complex people with corresponding needs. And breaking it down into intersectional strategy and the variety of layers of identity. But we also must remain vigilant on all these different levels, from medical and behavioral health, basic needs, community engagement, and individual empowerment. Of course, must remain mindful of basic needs being met, starting from, of course, behavioral health and medical care, and housing, education, training, employment, getting benefits activated. And it's much easier, of course, to talk about community engagement, social support networks, and individual empowerment when all those basic needs are being met. So just to summarize, conserving the fighting strength, which is something that we heard very often in the Army, is something that we want to apply to the veteran community. And we want to continue to, well, actually we can't continue to treat our fellow comrades with prejudice or idly stand by and allow it. It means being honest with yourself and taking appropriate action, from screening tools being used prior to entry into military service through veterans healthcare. The burden of educating institutions shouldn't fall on individual veterans seeking help. And this is something that I've heard not only from fellow veterans, but also veterans who are working in the VA system and for other VSOs. It's up to everybody involved to be open to accepting that there is far more to learn, including myself. Even though I have a lot of different marginalized, intersecting qualities, we all have to be honest with ourselves that, of course, we're not all perfect, but we have to do a lot better. And we have to learn how to incorporate a lot of these voices of marginalized veterans to be part of building a more inclusive, diverse, and equitable environment and veteran culture. So we went just a little bit over an hour, but this is our contact information. And of course, if you do want to get additional resources, we'll be sure to plug it in toward the end of this presentation. So when we turn it in, we can have anything else that we can help answer any additional questions from hereafter. But other than that, Lindsay, do you have anything else? Okay, well, we do want to say thank you. I'll leave this up for a second, but we did want to open the floor for discussion and any questions if you have any.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you, Lindsay. You've raised some really interesting points, and you've also highlighted a number of things we've actually heard from other presenters, which is great. It says that there is some common themes running through this space, and I certainly appreciated your comments about the lack of insight and data and knowledge that's there around these topics. We have just let me here. We've got a couple of questions that you raised for me. You've raised an interesting way of looking at these issues by introducing the intersectional theory and that lens of looking at these issues. How important do you think it is that we start to look at these things through a different set of eyes or a different set of lenses to the way we've looked at them. The reason I ask that question is because in so many of our countries, we look at things through one particular lens because we've always looked at it through that lens. We don't challenge and question. How important is it to actually question those things? And around that intersectional theory, you've explained that, and you've drawn out some really interesting things. How are there other things in addition to that we should be starting to explore to try and better understand what's going on for this what is a significant, when you aggregate the population, a significant number of folks and a significant percentage of our serving and veteran population?
Well, I think that a common theme that we've noticed, whether anecdotally or looking at the data, is that it's not uncommon to see people work in silos or look through a very specific lens or a singular lens, even though, of course, everybody has all these different intersecting identities. But to provide an example, as somebody who is, a Chamorro woman, somebody who might not fully understand what that means, also means that I'm going to have to be explaining what that is. I'm going to be playing Google Maps to somebody who's providing me care, but it's not something I necessarily want to be fully focused on. It's nice to have it incorporated and for a provider to be mindful of, but it shouldn't be the sole focus. I've often said that these boxes that people try to place us in, whether they are true or not, often look and feel like coffins. That once you put people in a box, done, don't need to know anything else about it. And it's a very simplistic way of looking at complex individuals. And the thing with the intersectional lens, in addition to a comprehensive intake, is that it's work. It takes work. It takes asking tough questions that can sometimes make providers or even the clients uncomfortable. But these are things that need to be incorporated and counted. And often you might find that veterans might not have been asked those questions because a provider might not have known any better or didn't think it was important to ask. And even if somebody's not comfortable answering a question right away, at least it's something that is, okay, this is something that we can circle back to and cover. But yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of people tend to look at, even in the veteran community, through a singular lens, that we're looking at minority veterans, or we're looking at women veterans, or whichever lens that we're looking at, to say, this is the veteran population, this is where they belong, that's it. And that's simply not true.
Oh, you're Robert, you muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, you talked about reintegration later in your presentation, and one of the things that we've heard actually from other presenters, and not just from the US, from other countries, is this challenge of one, recognition. You both mentioned that, that recognition that you are a veteran. And then that was not just with service providers, so healthcare, etc., but was within the general community, that this recognition factor. So I guess my question is,
look, can I answer your question first?
Yeah.
Your first question. So I think you're asking a question about looking at things differently and using intersectionality as a way of approaching things, and how important that is. And so especially, I mean, I only work in the United States and we're minority veterans of America. So we generally, what we see is the same epidemics that haven't changed much in the last 5, 10, 15 years. We're seeing the suicide epidemic. The number has basically plateaued. And if you look at this from the lens of just like an athlete, right? Like the athletes, once they plateau, they don't keep doing the same thing. They don't keep running the same route. They don't keep eating the same things. When they realize that they plateaued, they look at the problem differently. They say, how can I train differently? How can I do something differently? How can I approach this, whatever it is that I'm trying to beat this plateau? When I look at the number of 22 veterans a day, right? Well, we've dumped billions, I think at this point, into trying to address the issue of veteran suicide. Well, we keep coming up with the same solutions. They're just a tiny bit different. But what we're not doing is programming to the margins. And so we've figured out as a country how to get to the bulk, right? Like we know veterans are generally these accepted stereotypes. Like we know how to like problem solve to these specific stereotypes. Well, now that we're done with these like stereotypes that we've been serving and the people that we've been continuing to tailor our services to for decades at this point, well, we got that now. Now let's figure out what we don't have, what we're not figured out. How do we create services that go to the margins? Because I can almost guarantee you that anybody will tell you that if you program to the margins first, you get to the bulk of the people, better. From like the example of a person that experiences hearing loss, right? Well, during Zoom time, during pandemic, when nobody can use technology, the use of closed captions are so important to that person being able to engage in the work. Well, if you don't have closed captions, you can't always expect that lip reading is going to get you there. Well, guess what? You turn closed captions on, and the whole world has the ability to interact with the meeting a lot better. They can start to read what they need to. They can turn things on mute. They can actually, people that are just happen to read and understand better than when they listen are actually able to get more out of it. So when you program to that margin, you're bringing in more services for the people that are in the bulk. And so to me, like, I think that the thing that like stepping outside of or like moving beyond intersectionality is recognizing what's happening at the margins, what's happening at the intersections themselves of understanding what these systems of oppressions, when they're compounding, actually do, what they do to a person's life. And so when we get to that point where we've gone to the margins and we've gone further out into the fray to understand how we serve those folks, that's when I think that intersectionality goes into practice and we have the ability to actually serve folks better.
Because one of the things that came to mind when you were talking there is sometimes we do what we do because we do what we do, and we're comfortable. That's why we don't challenge ourselves. I like your point about when we go out, we're not actually excluding, we're actually including, and the inclusion actually assists the great bulk. It's a value add to the great bulk. It's not a diminution to the majority, if that's the right way to describe it. 100%. I was going to ask you this question about sort of the coming out at the other end, but I'll leave that for later, because we've got a question here around the intersectional framework in healthcare. This is the question. Also takes more time. It isn't just about provider willingness, but also limits due to overscheduling and trying to see as many people as possible. So I guess from that, the question really is that aside, how important is it that we focus on the needs of the individual rather than try and the broad brush, what I call the dunk you're done, that we actually focus on individuals as individuals around their need, their individual circumstances and needs.
You want to answer that, Lindsay?
Do you want to start? I'm not a service provider, but I can tell you anecdotally from I'm from a provider perspective of just regular services. So one of the things that over time, so I've been doing this work within this organization for the last 3 years. I've been working in the veteran space for about 7. What I have found is that over time, as I do more learning and understanding and do more educating myself, I get faster at being able to recognize what comes with that experience. And while we don't like to live the world to experience, like stereotyping people, one of the things that understanding and educating yourself helps to do is to broaden beyond that stereotype into actual knowledge. And once you start to really build that knowledge base, the ability to pull those specific cues, right? Like, so Michelle, to your point, you were pulling out the different maps, right? Like, well, once I start to do more research, once I start to dig in more, I'm able to pull that bubble and say, what is this person has this experience? I'm going to be able to recognize like these couple of things, like it might not be to the point where like I don't do paperwork, but I do educate myself to the point where I start to actually have more time to be able to understand that person because I've educated myself in my own time.
Yeah, and the intersectional lens is pretty much a starting point. That if this is something that's new for you, if you've been painting with a broad brush, this is something that is to help keep you mindful and to also use as a tool for yourself in terms of where do you have that education or where is it lacking and how can you be better about it. And I also agree with Lindsay that when it comes to building upon that knowledge and actually looking into that, you do become a bit more efficient at, and you notice these things. You notice a lot of things that tend to go right past people. And speaking, anecdotally too, when it came to getting care, it was hard to keep explaining to different providers like, hey, this is what I'm going through, and them not really understanding if I was seeing a civilian provider who is not involved in the veterans community, what that was like, and having to educate them on the veteran identity, or going to a vet center and having to explain that, yeah, I'm a combat veteran, or having them to engage in, for lack of better terms, a pissing contest to see like, oh, well, I was in this part of Iraq, where were you? It's like, no, this is not how this is supposed to go. But when I finally did find a good provider and that I was able to see progress, was somebody who actually not necessarily, spent extra time. It was more a matter of being open to listening about my perspective, which I understand is somewhat of a unique perspective because going in as a Pacific Islander is not necessarily something that everyone has worked with in the United States veteran healthcare system. And you often do have to explain yourself. And I found a provider who was a white woman who was a bit older than me, who had a Samoan stepdad or Samoan in-law or Samoan relative, that they were like, oh, well, I am familiar with these things. And I understand that, you're from a different culture and everything, but she would ask me questions that were sensitive and based off of that in terms of like, what do you feel that you would help? And how do you feel like this could impact your care? And these were all questions that were asked with compassion. And I'm not saying that you need to, be a walking lexicon of all these different identity lenses. It's just a matter of going in with an open mind. And the intersectionality lens is just a way to organize a lot of those thoughts. Because if you're pressed for time and you're asking questions and you're trying to get to the meat and potatoes of what's going on, a lot of these things might not really register for you. So having that as a starting point and just being like, okay, what am I missing something here? And being able to look at something that has a lot of these different intersecting qualities is just serving to be helpful.
I mean, it also raises this thing of the interrelationship between the different elements of culture and how they then play out or how they manifest in the experiences of people, and then what is the long-term, the mid and long-term impact of that on individuals. And one of the things that working around the space for a couple of years now is that we tend to want to look at events or things as individual standalone events, and we don't really look at the interrelationship and the holistic picture of what's going on and what comes together, and how things either compound or they actually build greater protection, or they build greater resilience, or they provide greater assistance to people who are navigating a particular stage of their life. So I think that's a great asset that you've brought that concept into the conversation, and something that I think really enriches, if we want to stop and look at it and think about it, really enriches not only the way we look at it, but the way that we may want to move forward to start to address things, rather than rushing in with our band-aid to stick the band-aid on the wound, asking ourselves, is that really the issue, or is there something else we need to address if we want, using a medical analogy, that we want the patient to get well? One of the things that you talked about was this lack of data and information and actual work around our minorities, and whether that's ethnic and culturally and linguistically different minorities, Indigenous or LGBTI, and even women as a group itself. What do you think are some of the key things that we need to be starting to collect or put together by way of data and insights? So if I was developing a research program effectively, what would be your suggestions about some of the key priorities in bringing this together?
I would think all the different lenses that we've mentioned throughout the presentation, and going through every single intersecting identity. Something that we brought up, of course, a few times was excluding certain races from the data. And you see this not only in veterans data, but you see this in other aspects of, non-veteran mental health, where they say, oh, well, we didn't have enough time, we didn't have enough funding to reach out to Native Americans, we didn't have enough time or funding to reach out to Pacific Islanders. And it's really a matter of, okay, well, is this research being done objectively and compassionately? And I would say it would be neither if that's the way that the research is being conducted. Depending on what exactly it is that you're researching would depend on which factors that you're going to be considering for those intersecting identities. But yeah, this has come up a lot in terms of these kinds of studies. And instead of getting defensive, which has happened a few times when I asked, like, hey, I've noticed you include Black veterans, I noticed you include Latinx veterans, I noticed you include Asian Americans and white veterans, but you have other, or you don't have any other group. What happened? And sometimes you'll get a defensive response, and other times they'll be like, well, we weren't aware. So there needs to be a broader education on how to do that. But if you're in charge of creating this research project or initiative, why weren't those questions asked? And we actually, Lindsay and I had this discussion right before the presentation that, if this person or this group is the ordained subject matter expert, where are these gaps and why weren't these questions asked? You have the US Census that you can go off and look at federally recognized ethnic groups. You have, a really good baseline that you can start from. And yeah, I think that it's pretty much determined by who is running the research and how exactly they're doing it. But it's not equitable when it's not inclusive.
For me, I think one of the biggest things about, as far as research, besides like what we've already indicated, which is that better data quality, I mean, especially for LGBTQ folks, like that's not even collected. I mean, poor data processing is one thing, but even collecting the information is a completely different, in my experience, generally when people are not asked the question, it's to erase their memory. And not just to erase the improper outcomes or the disparate outcomes, it's to erase their identity altogether. And so to not even, it's been since 2012 in the US, since they lifted the Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That was 8 years at this point. We haven't even had a conversation about whether or not we would even collect LGBTQ status. We're still not even talking about it. There's still new policies coming out about it. And so we haven't even broached the conversation about how do we collect that information. And even at this point, the community won't trust anybody enough to be able to give that without believing that they're going to be put on a list for discharge later, or to in some way lose their benefits. So that just LGBTQ numbers in general, but better processing of the data. I think one of the things is like the VA has a lot of data. The Department of Veterans Affairs has a ton of data. It's a matter of, are we going to explore that data to actually look at life outcomes? One of the biggest things that I think needs to be done is, we talk all the time about equitable and equity gaps and all of these things, and I still think that most people don't understand what equity actually means. because we can't put a number to what the equity gap is. We can't put a determining outcome. Like, we can barely even at this point start pulling out the average household incomes of these minority veterans themselves and looking at these, you know, disparate outcomes. But at the end of the day, we're not looking or taking a systems approach to the equity gap and understanding it. So how do we expect that we're going to be able to address the equity gap and move right to equality? Because I think most people want to forget that equity needs to happen before we can get to an equal footing. So I think the biggest thing for, like, in my mind is being able to figure out how do we quantify that equity gap and how do we move that needle.
Mm-hmm. You also raised the issue about trust, and that's something we've heard broadly, particularly about the post-2000 service members and veterans, regardless of whether they're mainstream, minorities, whatever. Their trust is an issue. And then listening to you today, I thought about that in the sense of probably the high levels that, and you might want to comment on that, the high levels of suspicion that maybe minority veterans have when they join anyway because of their previous experiences. So how does that play into this trust thing, and especially when they leave, trusting healthcare providers, trusting advocacy groups, trusting support agencies, trusting people within the community? How important is it that we work on building trust? And what are some of the things you think with minorities that groups, say veteran support agencies or not-for-profits who are working to support this community, government agencies like VA, could do to actually build trust, build a relationship, I guess?
There's so much to go off of that. Lindsay, do you want to start?
You can go ahead. I'll go.
Like you're brimming with a response, but when it comes to building trust, it's something that, of course, I've had my suspicions about going back into VA care. And even though I am, you know, generally kind to people I meet for the first time, I've noticed that different facilities have a lot of the same problems. So building upon that trust, let's say in a provider sense, has to do with the same kind of compassion and consideration that you would use with anyone that you're meeting for the first time. There have been times that I've talked with somebody who was a veteran center provider, and they would say like, oh, well, you're this ethnicity, aren't you? So you would know X, Y, and Z. And the assumption was already put on me before I opened my mouth. So a lot of these different rushes to put people into a specific category, especially when they're wrong, is indicative of a personal and professional issue, that it is your position to not only understand your positionality and that person's access to power within the system, but also not leaning entirely on the veteran to provide an extensive education where that person could be doing it on their own. So building that trust has to do with listening and asking compassionate questions, because trust can't be built based off of like, hey, I've got all this great data about you, I've read about Pacific Islanders, like, yeah, that's great, but all it's going to take is one, one comment to just be like, all right, this is done, it's over. And I think so long as those stereotypes are kept out of care, that are not uncommon still today, that you can lead with that. You can build trust with that. You can build trust with creating a safe environment for people to actually express themselves. And I think that when it comes down to it, whether it's any other aspect of my identity, whether it's as a veteran, as a woman, as a social worker, it's more important that I am not judged coming into the room, that I am simply listened to, that it's not imperative that somebody understands and gets me right away. It's more of a matter of, can I talk to them without them trying desperately to place me in a box? when they're talking to me, are they trying to figure out what race I am? And just like, and I can usually see like, all right, get it over with. Like, ask me the damn question. So these kinds of little, you know, social nuances are things that we should talk about. They're uncomfortable, but these are the questions and the conversations that we need to have to get past these hurdles. And so long as we keep burying it underneath and slapping band-aids on issues, we're not going to get better.
Lindsay, did you?
Excuse me, sorry about that. Yeah, so from my perspective, I think one of the things, the biggest piece of advice that I have for anybody trying to build trust with military veterans, especially new ones, is there's an inherent recognition that needs to be had that you're undoing a culture that's harmed us. Military service, especially from a provider perspective, when you're looking at from physical and mental health components alone, like most from the American military perspective, at least, of like, we join the military knowing they're going to break us down and build us back into what they want. And we literally sign up knowing that that is like the phrase, we're going to break you down and build you back into what we want. Well, that's inherently traumatic. No matter who you are, no matter how strong-headed you are, military service is inherently traumatic. And then beyond that, that's just basic training. That's just the baseline training that everybody gets. So then when you're looking at beyond that, what happens in a person's identity and experience, and how does that bring, you know, like have a certain experience and breaks that trust and that harm? Well, when you get out, like you're carrying that all with you. And the newer you are to being a service member, the more raw and vulnerable and angry. Like I don't know that I've met very many veterans that aren't angry at some point, like in just angry in the things that have happened to them and the things that continue to happen to them. And part of that is just staying with it. Like you have to be consistent. You have to continue to show up. You have to continue to listen. You have to slow down. Like the military pumps people through. We know, like when you go to military mental health, when you go to military physical health, they're generally pushing you through because you feel like a number. At some point, somebody has to make you feel like an individual so that you can actually get to a point where you could talk to them and trust them. But so long as you are continuing to perpetuate them as a number and continuing, despite the fact that I mean, even on the side of a patient, like I recognize that there are inherent burdens of time and constraints. But when, to Michelle's point about getting to know the patient in the beginning, the more you get to know them in the beginning, the less time you spend figuring them out in the end. So it might be a lot of work in the beginning, and it might be a lot of like front end work. It might take you a little longer to do the intake. But when you're asking questions, one, you're asking from like the perspective of like, these are some of my intake questions. So it's not offensive for you to ask me what my race is and has that impacted my mental health along the way. At least, I mean, Michelle, you can probably point to whether or not that is, but like, but if that's where you're asking me rather than asking me probing questions about whether or not I identify as transgender, like it's a very different environment that you're setting up when you go to do those questions and those baseline questions at the beginning, and you've done your research and understand what those things mean when you get them at the end. But that ultimately, like you're taking that time and that reduces the amount of time you have to do in the end. So ultimately it's like you're undoing a culture that's harmed us. You have to continue to show up and you have to continue to take your time so that we aren't continuing to feel like we're rushed through the process again. Phones are giving out. But leading to those outcomes that we don't trust,
Yeah. There's a couple of really good points there that could warrant a really long conversation, I guess. I think the main takeaway, if I understand you both, is actually one of the things that shows that you have a genuine interest is actually to ask the questions and not skirt around the issue. So I think that's important. Often, to me, my experience is it's a sign of the person asking the questions, their insecurities and fears, not of the individual that's seeking the help.
Well, if you're asking the question for a reason, it's generally less offensive than if you're just skirting around it and not asking. Like if you legitimately have a reason to ask somebody's race or ethnicity because you're in a provider perspective and you know that that's going to provide context to be able to provide culturally competent and informed care, that's a completely different environment than like me trying to like awkwardly grab at Michelle, like asking you your race without asking you your race, without me really having an intention to know that.
Yeah. which leads into another point that you raised again, which we've heard in other presentations, is around this question of identity and how we see ourselves. And you talked about the impact of the way people are treated on their identity and so on. And the fracturing, I think you used the word fracturing, my sense of who I am. How important do you think it is that, again, people, probably us wanting to change the military is sort of maybe the ultimate goal, but probably the big ask. And so I guess my interest is focusing on people who are going to help when you come out of the system. So how important is it for providers and people who want to work with and support veterans, particularly from minorities, to be cognizant of about this thing around identity and seeking to understand how the veteran sees themselves, which will be, I guess, going back to Michelle's point, a mix of maybe their cultural heritage, their life experience based on the communities they came from, and then again with the LGBTQ community, their own experiences. So one, how important is helping people to rediscover or affirm their identity in a healthy way? And two, what can or do organizations and individuals and communities working with those people need to be mindful of in around the identity and how these people see themselves?
I think that's one thing that I found even in my own veteran reintegration process, was that it's not so much important that people have the answers, that providers or VSOs or even your friends have the answers for you. I've often believed that people exist as signposts, that when we're allowed the space to express ourselves, to express a trauma, to have somewhere to put it, we often get to find out what those answers are for ourselves. And part of that role in terms of provider and patient is to create the space for allowing that expression to happen. And so long as we get bogged down into just shoving people into boxes or treating them as numbers, we're not doing that. It's not compassionate care. And if you're really wanting to see a better return, better outcomes, you're going to have to incorporate a more intersectional lens. And there's really no way around it. And it's not until I actually got intersectional care that I actually felt seen within the VA healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
And from my perspective, I think as far as how important is it, like I actually think that being able to self-identify and fully be authentic to who you are can change and save your life. So I think it's of the most utmost and imperative thing that we figure out how to give people the ability to show up fully as themselves and their authentic selves. I also, the thing that to your point of being what needs to be cautioned is that this has to be done in a place where people have agency. So, you know, to the point of like asking people their race and like reaching at certain things, if a person's not ready to tell you what that is, they need the agency to be able to not. From my own perspective, like when I first got out of the military, when I talked about that fracture of identity, I'll tell you that I learned that from my own experience of having my identity fractured. So I served for 4 years and served all but 3 months under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So when I got out, like I very much did not know how to be a veteran, mostly I just chose to be a veteran rather than an LGBTQ person. But I had to like really be ready to undo that fracture when my therapist was ready to talk about it. But if you had asked me at that point if I was ready to talk about, my sexual orientation, I was not ready to talk about my gender identity. And if you had pushed me at that point and not given me the agency to be able to say like, let's talk about this thing, but I'm not quite ready to go there, you might have pushed me too far. So I think one of the things is like recognizing indicators of like, I think I keep losing my headphones in this, but recognizing that people need agency in that conversation and that that's the most important part. Like that's essentially getting agency is a consent of this particular process, is like making sure that people have that agency to opt out and be ready for what they're ready for. Because not everybody's gonna be ready to talk about the things that you know are, and you may know in your heart of hearts that it's impacting their lives, but you can't push them past where they're ready.
Yeah, yeah. So it's sort of that I think that's a really interesting point you raised, is about this agency. How do we empower people and give them a sense of agency and empowerment in their lives? That yes, they might need some support and they might need some help, but they need to feel that sense of empowerment in the process. So that's a really great point, which sort of leads us back to that question I was going to ask earlier about this reintegration. So we're moving out and back into the community. And it's around how do you, and you talked about different aspects of this, both of you, as you went through the presentation, but I guess how the underpinning question for me is, how do we strengthen communities in a broad sense of what a community is to better respond and support veterans? So you might have some thoughts about that. But the other part is going back to that, you talked about this as well, and others have spoken about this, is that the onus shouldn't be on the individual veteran to educate. So whose role, the second part of the making welcoming places, is who's responsible to actually lead that conversation or lead the charge on helping to create those welcoming spaces, those informed communities? Is it any one party, or are there numbers of people that need to be involved in that, do you think? And especially from the point of view of minorities.
So do you want to go first, Michelle?
Oh, no, you can go first.
So from the first, how do you strengthen communities? I think especially from the provider perspective, right? Community, I think for me and for what we do, is the focus is on community leading community. Part of that is like empowering the community itself to lead itself. So minority veterans leading minority veterans, peer support specialists, people that actually represent those identities, being the first line of defense, is one of the strongest things that you can help, or that you can do for communities, empowering communities or communities leading communities. I think it's very important that at least a contingency or a component of the leadership of any community be leading itself. In addition is like, whose role is it, right? So going back to the conversation around time and like what the, like educating yourself. So I'm a big proponent of educating yourself first, because I think that oftentimes we were pushed really hard to do diversity work first, right? Well, I think that's actually the opposite of what we should be doing. We should be doing inclusion work first. If we're going to get people to come in our doors that represent minority identities, we need to be looking at inside ourselves and in our own culture of our organizations and the people that we serve to be able to actually serve them better. So the onus is on us as far as service providers and providers within organizations to make our organizations stronger. So it's not on the person itself, it's not on Michelle sitting in a, in an intake interview to tell them everything about them. It's on the provider to recognize what's important and how can we bring those pieces together without making it also tokenizing. Because one of the biggest problems that I have with diversity work is that it's often tokenizing. We don't recognize that it's really important to recognize the environment and the garden in which we expect these to expect our community to thrive in. If you haven't done anything to tend to that soil and you haven't done anything to tend to your organization to grow, you are actually harming the people that come into your garden. I'm a gardening analogy person, so sorry about that. But I think that ultimately the role is on your organizational leadership and on your providers to actually do that education on there. And it's not on the individual to tell you like you need to do more education on this. Like if you have somebody, if you've harmed somebody already, it's too late to do that education to stop that harm. So for me, it's learning about your expertise, like digging into those areas and being the leader in your organization or wherever you are in those specific things. Like nobody expects you to be the expert in every single person or like every single identity base, but they do expect you to have an expertise and be able to serve certain people and be able to actually dig in and lead your own education efforts in that.
Yeah, I would say to piggyback off that is that, no, that's perfect. But when we're looking at institutions to improve DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that you can invite a lot of these own voices, people who are speaking from their own communities, to come in and educate. But it shouldn't happen in a patient setting where you're relying on, oh, so tell me, how many degrees north is the Marianas? How far is this from Japan? And you're like, this shouldn't be happening in a patient setting where it's like, pull out your phone, dude, figure it out. But these are the kinds of things that do happen, and it seems silly, but they do happen. And it really is up to veteran institutions, veteran service organizations, and anybody working in the veteran community to educate themselves as best they can, but also allow people from those respective communities to speak for themselves, and that there are people who can provide that education. It's just that we're often not included in the process. We're often excluded from a lot of ongoing active military through veteran community conversations about what changes need to happen.
I mean, that's a really good point, is that we need to hear a greater diversity of voices. Personal view here is that we need to have greater diversity of voices and perspectives in these conversations. As someone said, if you always look at it from the same point of view, you come to the same conclusion, which leads you to do what you've always done. And I think it was Einstein who said, if you keep doing what you're doing, you always get the same answer. So we need that diversity of voices and perspectives. I want to end by saying thank you very much for being part of that diversity of voices to put those views and experiences and insights into the conversation, because they are very, very necessary. And I think a personal view here, what you shared today sort of has built on and extended some of the pointers that had already been flagged by others. And that's really, for me, quite exciting to have happen. So I want to thank you both very much for your sharing your experiences and your insights and giving your time to contribute to the conversation. And as we move forward, I hope that both of you will continue to want to be part of the conversation and contribute to the discussion that is underway around these issues. And I'm sure there will be some people who will want to talk to you coming out of today. That's really great if that occurs. So thank you to you both very much for your contribution to the conversation and the thinking about looking at these populations from a different perspective and seeing different things that we need to think about and we need to respond to in a positive way. Thank you to those of you who have joined us today. It's great to have you here. We hope that you will join us when next we convene, which will be next week, when we'll be looking at the experience of LGBTIQ service members and veterans in the UK, and where we'll hear and add, I guess, some other dimensions to the conversation based on their experiences. So thank you, everybody. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in the world.